Colonel laughed at her rank patch until her file showed. She outranked everyone in the room. Colonel Grant Whitlock laughed out loud when he saw her patch. "Would you look at this?" he said to the officers around him, loud enough for the whole receiving line to hear. Somebody let a reservist wander into the officers' reception. "Sweetheart, the enlisted mess is one building over." The Fort Braddock Officers Club glittered that evening the way only military ceremony can. Brass polished to mirrors, dress uniforms pressed into blades, a color guard standing frozen by the doors. Every colonel and major on the installation had come for the assumption of command reception, the night before the new commanding general would arrive. And into the middle of all that spit and shine walked a woman in travel-worn combat utilities. A duffel over one shoulder, a subdued patch on her sleeve so faded you could barely read the unit. Whitlock stood at the center of it all in his dress blues, a glass of bourbon in his hand. And he pointed at that patch like it was a joke he'd been waiting all night to tell. Major Dale Prescott, his adjutant, snorted into his drink. Two younger captains laughed because the colonel laughed. The woman said nothing. She straightened the duffel on her shoulder and looked at him with the patient eyes of someone who had waited out sandstorms. What Whitlock didn't know was that the woman he'd just called sweetheart had flown 11 hours from a forward operating base to be there. What Prescott didn't know was that the faded patch on her sleeve belonged to a unit that had lost 9 men pulling wounded off a mountain, and that she had been one of them, and what none of them knew, not the colonel, not the adjutant, not a single laughing officer in that room, was that by the time the sun came up, Grant Whitlock's 26-year career would be quietly, permanently over, and this woman would be the reason. A young staff sergeant working the coat station near the door had gone very still when she walked in. He'd taken one look at how she carried herself and set his jaw and stood up a little straighter, though he couldn't have said why. "Mom," he said quietly as she passed, "can I take your bag?" She smiled at him, the first real smile anyone had earned from her all night. "Thank you, Sergeant. But I've been carrying my own for a long time." She read his name tape. "Bell. You've got a kid." He blinked. "How'd you? The way you're watching that clock." She nodded at the wall. "You keep checking it like somebody's waiting on you." Staff Sergeant Marcus Bell looked at her for a long moment. "Yes, ma'am. My boy. His grandmother's got him tonight, but he doesn't sleep till I text him good night." He didn't know why he was telling a stranger this. Something in her face just pulled the truth out. She nodded like she understood exactly and moved on into the room, and Bell went back to his station wondering who she was. He'd find out soon enough. They all would. 31 hours earlier, Brigadier General Rachel Dunn had been standing on a gravel airstrip on the other side of the world, saying goodbye to soldiers she'd led for a year, wondering if she'd remember how to be a mother again. That was the part none of them at the reception could have guessed. That before she was a general, before the flag officer's star and the classified briefings and the 11-hour flight, Rachel Dunn had been a 24-year-old widow standing at a graveside in the rain, holding a folded flag and a daughter who was still too young to understand what the 21 guns meant. Her husband, Sergeant First Class Michael Dunn, had been killed clearing a compound outside Kandahar when their daughter Emma was 2. Rachel had been a lieutenant then. Everyone told her she'd get out. Young widow, baby girl, a survivor's pension, and a hometown that would take her back. Nobody would have blamed her for hanging it up. She almost did. She sat on the floor of a base housing unit for 3 nights with the discharge paperwork in front of her and Emma asleep in the next room, and she couldn't sign it. Not because she was brave, because she couldn't stand the idea that everything Michael believed in would end at his grave. that the country he'd bled for would just close over him like water. So she stayed, and she raised a daughter out of a rucksack. She learned to French braid hair over a video call from a plywood hut in the mountains. She missed the first day of kindergarten and made it home for the second. She sewed her husband's old subdued unit patch, the one from his last deployment, the one they'd handed her with his effects, onto the inside of her own field jacket, right over her heart, where the regs would never see it and the enemy would never know. It had been there through 4 combat tours, 3 promotions, and a decade of choosing over and over. A country that did not always choose her back. That patch was not a decoration. It was a marriage and a promise, and the only piece of him she still got to carry into the fight. She'd flown home on a red-eye that had turned into a delay, that had turned into a rerouting, and she'd landed at the regional airfield with 2 hours to spare and no time to change. She'd told her aide to go ahead without her. She hated the fuss, hated the sedans and the salutes and the way rooms rearranged themselves when a star walked in. She wanted just once to arrive somewhere the way an ordinary soldier arrives, tired, rumpled, carrying her own bag. She wanted to see the command she was about to lead the way it actually was before it dressed up for her. She had gotten exactly what she wished for. She just hadn't expected the room to spit on it. Inside the reception, Colonel Whitlock had already moved on from his joke, the way a man does when he's certain he's the most important person in every room he enters. He'd been the acting installation commander for 4 months, and he'd made the most of it. He'd rearranged the parking. He'd instituted new uniform inspections that fell hardest on the youngest soldiers. He'd told anyone who'd listened that the incoming general was a diversity hire, from what I hear, and that he intended to show the flag until real leadership, meaning himself, got its due. Everyone had heard he'd been passed over for his own star twice. Nobody said it to his face. Rachel found a quiet corner with a cup of coffee and watched. This was the part of the job the movies never showed, the watching. You could learn everything about a command in 20 minutes if you just shut up and paid attention to who laughed at whose jokes and who flinched when the boss walked by. She didn't have to watch long. Whitlock spotted her again across the room, and his mouth curled. He crossed the floor with Prescott trailing behind him. "You're still here," he said. "This is a closed function, Sergeant, or whatever you are. I don't know what unit told you that patch was appropriate for an officer's reception, but you can turn right around." "I was invited, Colonel," Rachel said. "By who?" "By the United States Army." Prescott laughed. Whitlock didn't. Something in her flat, unhurried tone had put a small crack in his certainty, and he didn't like the feeling. He looked her up and down, the faded utilities, the scuffed boots, the duffel she'd set by the wall, and decided the feeling was ridiculous. "Cute," he said. "Tell you what, since you're so eager to be here, make yourself useful. Bar's running low on ice. Go find the kitchen." He turned his back on her, and that to him was the end of it. Rachel looked at his back for exactly 2 seconds. Then she picked up her coffee and walked, not to the kitchen, but to the coat station, where Staff Sergeant Bell was quietly failing not to check the clock again. "He always like that?" she asked. Bell hesitated. Talking about a colonel to a stranger was a good way to end a career. But she'd earned something, somehow, in the 30 seconds they'd spoken. "Permission to speak freely, ma'am?" "Always." "Yes, he's always like that." Bell's voice dropped. "Last month, my son had a fever of 104. I asked to leave an hour early. Colonel Whitlock told me in front of my whole section that single fathers shouldn't have signed up if they wanted to play mommy. Made me stay till 1800 anyway. My mother took the boy to the ER without me. He stopped, embarrassed. "Sorry, ma'am. You asked." Rachel Dunn had spent a career keeping her face still. She kept it still now, but something moved behind her eyes. Cold and slow, the way a front moves in before a storm you can already smell. "What's your son's name, Sergeant?" "Tyler. He's 6. "And who watches Tyler when you deploy?" "My mom. She's 71. He gave a tired half smile. "It's me and him and her, ma'am. We make it work. Everybody's got a plan for something. Tyler's my plan for everything." Across the room, Whitlock had noticed the reservist was talking to his coat sergeant instead of fetching ice, and his face was starting to color. Prescott leaned in to whisper something, glancing back at Rachel with a puzzled frown. He just remembered something. The incoming general's advance party had reported the general's flight was delayed, that she might arrive tonight unannounced. He looked at the woman by the coat station, at the way she stood, at the way even Belle had straightened up around her. A cold little thought started to form. Before he could say it out loud, the club's event coordinator hurried past, ringing a small bell, calling everyone toward the ceremony hall. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you'll take your seats, we have an announcement." Whatever Prescott had been about to realize, the room swept it away. The colonel got his moment first, and he grabbed it with both hands. He was to give brief remarks, a courtesy, since he'd been acting commander, before the arrival of the new general was formally acknowledged. He strode to the podium with the confidence of a man who believed the star was a clerical error that would eventually correct itself in his favor. He talked about standards. He talked about what this installation had become under decisive leadership. He said, and the microphone carried it to every corner, that some of the newer soldiers had forgotten that the Army is not a daycare. And he looked, when he said it, directly at Staff Sergeant Bell standing at the back. Rachel, seated quietly in the third row where an usher had put her, watched Bell's ears go red. She watched a 6-year-old's father take a public insult and swallow it because a colonel outranked his dignity. And she made a decision she had, in truth, made hours ago on the airstrip without knowing his name. Whitlock finished to polite applause. The garrison's outgoing deputy commander, a silver-haired one-star named Major General Ellis Ward, took the podium. Ward had known Rachel Dunn for 15 years. He had recommended her for this command. He looked out at the room, and his eyes found her in the third row, in her travel-stained utilities, and the corner of his mouth twitched. "Before we go further," Ward said, "I want to correct the record. Colonel Whitlock referred to our new commanding officer as an unknown quantity. She's not unknown to me." He lifted a folder. "So let me read from her file, and you can decide for yourselves." The room quieted the way a room does when it senses the floor shifting. "Commissioned 20 years ago. Widowed at 24, mother of 1, chose to remain in service." Ward's voice was even, but it carried. 4 combat deployments. Bronze Star with Valor device for pulling 3 wounded soldiers off an exposed ridge under direct fire. She was hit twice doing it and finished the mission before she'd let a medic touch her. Legion of Merit. A Purple Heart she has never once mentioned to me in 15 years of friendship. Command of a forward brigade, widely rated the highest readiness unit in its theater. He set the folder down. "Ladies and gentlemen, your new installation commander outranks every officer in this room. It is my genuine honor to present Brigadier General Rachel Dunn." For a moment, nothing. Then Rachel Dunn stood up. The silence in the ceremony hall was total. 200 officers turned as one toward the woman in the third row, the reservist, the one they'd watched a colonel send to fetch ice as she rose, unhurried, and walked toward the stage. Colonel Whitlock's face drained from red to a chalky, terrible white. His bourbon glass stopped halfway to the table. Major Prescott sat down very suddenly in a chair that wasn't quite his. Somewhere near the back, Staff Sergeant Bell put his hand over his mouth, and his eyes were shining. Rachel took the podium. She did not smile. She reached up, unhurried, and turned back the lapel of her field jacket so the front row could see what was sewn on the inside. A subdued patch, worn nearly white with age, pressed against the place over her heart. "This," she said quietly, "is my husband's unit patch. Sergeant First Class Michael Dunn. He was killed in action 19 years ago, clearing a building so that other people's husbands could come home. I have carried it into every fight I have ever been in." She let that sit. A few minutes ago, a colonel in this room laughed at it, called me sweetheart, told me to go find the kitchen. She looked out at them. "I want every young soldier here to understand something tonight. I don't care what's on your sleeve. I care what's underneath it." She let her eyes travel the room and stop, briefly, on Whitlock. "Colonel Whitlock, you told this command, 40 minutes ago, that the Army is not a daycare." Her voice never rose. It didn't have to. "I command an installation of 9,000 soldiers. Thousands of them are parents. A great many are raising children alone. Staff Sergeant Bell in the back of this room took your public contempt tonight and said nothing because you outranked him. You don't anymore. I do." She turned back to the whole room. "The measure of an officer is not how he treats the people above him. It's how he treats the ones who can't fight back. By that measure, some of us have a great deal to answer for." Nobody applauded because it wasn't that kind of moment. But something in the room had realigned, the way iron filings snapped toward a magnet, and everyone in it could feel where North had moved. Afterward, in the quiet of the emptying hall, Bell found the courage to approach her. "General, I don't know what to say. About my son, about everything." "You don't have to say anything, Sergeant." She shook his hand. "Go text Tyler good night. Tell him his dad kept his head up in a room full of colonels. That's a thing a boy should know about his father." Bell nodded, unable to speak, and hurried out with his phone already in his hand. Major General Ward came up beside her as the room emptied. "You could have said who you were the second he opened his mouth," he murmured. "I know." "Why didn't you?" Rachel watched Whitlock across the room, being quietly steered toward a side door by two officers from higher command who had appeared as if from nowhere the moment the ceremony ended. "Because a man shows you exactly who he is when he thinks you're no one," she said. "He didn't insult a general tonight, Ellis. He insulted a woman he'd decided didn't matter. That's the man I needed the record to see." She picked up her duffel, her own bag, still, and slung it over her shoulder. "The consequences of tonight are just getting started, but not the ones he thinks. He'll worry about his career. I'm going to be worrying about the 9,000 people he was in charge of." By the following Monday, it was done. Colonel Grant Whitlock did not report to the installation headquarters he'd expected to run. He reported instead to a windowless office at higher command, where a general officer he had never met walked him through a folder considerably thicker than his own. It contained 16 months of complaints that had been quietly filed and quietly buried, soldiers denied family leave, an NCO dressed down in front of his section for taking his kid to the ER, a pattern of contempt that a room full of witnesses had watched him put on full display the very night the new commander arrived. Whitlock's request for a third promotion board was withdrawn at his own initiative, the memo said, which fooled no one. He was reassigned to a staff billet in a state most people can't find on a map. in a job that would end his career in 18 quiet months. He asked twice to speak with General Dunn. Both requests were declined. Some doors, once a man decides to sneer at whoever's standing in them, don't open again. Major Prescott discovered that the officers who had laughed at his jokes stopped returning his calls. His transfer request to Dunn's headquarters staff was denied without comment. He spent a long time telling anyone who'd listened that he'd always had a good feeling about the new general, and noticed that fewer and fewer people were listening. Cruelty, it turns out, is a loan taken out against your own future. The bill always comes. General Dunn heard about Whitlock's reassignment from Ward over coffee. She didn't smile. She nodded once, the way you nod at weather you saw coming. "I hope he learned something," was all she said, and she meant it. And then she went back to the readiness reports, because 9,000 people were her problem now, and one colonel was not. 3 weeks later, Staff Sergeant Marcus Bell was called to headquarters. He spent the drive over convinced he was in trouble. Instead, a smiling sergeant major handed him orders. A stabilized, family-friendly assignment right there on the installation, no deployment for 18 months, and a slot in the promotion cycle his old chain of command had somehow overlooked for 2 years. Clipped to the orders was a small handwritten note, unsigned, in a plain hand. A boy should get to keep his father close. R.D. Bell sat in his truck in the parking lot and read it 4 times. And then he called his mother, and then he called his son. And Tyler wanted to know if his dad had met any real generals. And Bell said, "Yeah, buddy. One. The realest one there is." On a Saturday morning at the end of that month, Rachel Dunn woke up without an alarm for the first time in longer than she could remember. Her quarters on the installation were bigger than any home she'd had, and it still felt strange to spread out. Down the hall, her daughter, 19 now, home from college for the weekend, half a lifetime past the toddler at the graveside, was making terrible coffee and singing to herself. Emma had grown up in a rucksack and turned out braver than her mother, which Rachel considered the only accomplishment on her record that mattered. "Mom," Emma called from the kitchen, "there's a whole box of your old stuff here. Do you know you kept Dad's patch this whole time? It's falling apart." Rachel came and stood in the doorway. On the counter, next to the terrible coffee, sat the folded field jacket with the faded patch sewn over the heart. "I know," she said. "You should get it reinforced or something before it's gone." Rachel picked it up, ran her thumb over the worn threads, the way she'd done 10,000 times in 10,000 dark places, and thought about a colonel who'd laughed at it, and a room that had gone silent, and a young father in the back with shining eyes, and a promise she'd made on the floor of a base housing unit 19 years ago, and had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, managed to keep. "No," she said. "I don't think I will. Some things you carry until you can't anymore." She set it down gently. "And then you make sure it meant something on the way." Emma didn't fully understand, and that was all right. Someday she would. For now, there was terrible coffee and a Saturday and a mother home at last. And outside the window, 9,000 soldiers, thousands of them, somebody's mom, somebody's dad, somebody's whole plan for everything. Under the command of a woman who knew exactly what was underneath the uniform, because she'd been carrying hers over her heart the entire time.